Please join me in welcoming Helen Burnham.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was such a kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming today for the second installment of this course. The subject of the lecture today is Leonardo drawings, but I also want it to be an introduction to the exhibition. I know that quite a few of you are going to be leading tours of the exhibition, and this might be a good opportunity for us to cover some of the bases for you to be able to ask any questions you might have. So in the spirit of John Garton, the previous lecturer, who was a friend of mine actually from NYU, who in the audience is going to be leading tours of the exhibition? Hands? Yeah, okay. So quite a few. Well, let's get started then. We all know who this is. Just want to remind us that we know Leonardo through these works, these painted works, the Mona Lisa, obviously, in the Louvre in Paris, the Last Supper in Milan, which was recently restored, but was in pretty terrible condition fairly shortly after Leonardo painted it, unfortunately, because he used such an experimental technique. So we have in our minds these two are the big paintings that we think of as the iconic Leonardos. But unlike most artists, we also have some very iconic drawings in our head. So the Vitruvian Man has to be one of the most famous drawings of all time. This is pretty much the tip of the iceberg, though, in terms of Leonardo's drawings. There are thousands of Leonardo drawings that still exist. Probably there were many more even in his lifetime, although we don't know of him destroying his drawings the way that Michelangelo did before he died. Michelangelo destroyed quite a few of his drawings, basically to try to preserve his reputation for posterity. I'm not sure that any of us would agree with that. We seem to I love pretty much any scrap of work by Michelangelo, and we're lucky to have some of those in the exhibition as well. But Leonardo was a prodigious draftsman. He drew, as far as we can tell, constantly, just as much as he wrote, just as much as he examined the world around him. It's as if his hand and his eye were continually in concert. So why do I have this random picture here? Anyone want to guess? It's not a Leonardo. Anyone in the audience want to guess why there's a peacock on a cake? Some Renaissance-looking guys holding it. No volunteers? What's tomorrow? Yes, Leonardo's birthday. Okay, it's tax day also, but it's Leonardo's birthday. And it's possible that in his lifetime he might have been presented with a peacock cake. Although he might have been a vegetarian. I don't know if that included birds, but he was said to, and there are some quotes from him saying that he did not like to eat meat and that he thought that future generations would find it to be a scandalous, murderous practice. I am not one of those. But the peacock cake, we have Leonardo's life dates here. According to my calculations, tomorrow he would be about 563 years old. So rah, Leonardo, for showing up at the MFA on your 563rd birthday. Thank you very much. We're excited to have you. Leonardo was born in Vinci, which is a very small town, much smaller even now today. He was the illegitimate son of a notary, and it was a love connection, not a marriage connection. But he was soon taken into his father's household, and you heard a little bit about that from John last week. He dies in 1519 in Clou, in France, under the patronage of the French court. Because you know that in those days, in the Renaissance, artists had to find patrons, so they had to move from court to court. And Leonardo started out in Florence. He was in the studio of Andrea del Verrocchio. He had the patronage of the Medici, Then he moved to Milan, where he had the patronage of the Sforza family, but also accepted commissions from other groups, including ecclesiastical church groups. And then eventually he did move back to Florence, and then he moved, he had a long trajectory of different moves, but he eventually ended up in France, and so he becomes part of the history of French art as well as Italian art. And that is why the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre. It's also why you might think that would be why one of the other very important works in the exhibition was at one point in France, which is the Codex on the Flight of Birds, which comes to us from Turin. But actually, that was because it was stolen from Italy by Napoleon, and then later stolen back by an Italian, and made its way through a number of different hands back to Turin. So there are a lot of sub-stories and minor histories that accompany the fascinating works in the exhibition, and I will tell you a little bit more about them as we proceed. So back to our peacock theme. Why this peacock? Why are we talking about peacocks? Because this is a fairly straightforward representation of a peacock. It lies, in terms of the history of drawing, somewhere between a model book, so like the faces that John showed you last week that were types of people with different kinds of expressions that would have been handed down from the master artist to his apprentices to learn how to draw. So this is something like a peacock that would have showed you what a peacock looks like, how you could have used a peacock in a painting, in a manuscript page. That is how artistic ideas and tropes were passed down from one generation to another. And that's, for a long time, how drawing was used. And it wasn't even used really on paper. For a long time, artists, as they learned how to be artists, when they drew on tablets, so either wax or slate, or pretty much anything you can imagine, even drawing in sand. Sometimes architects would do that just to demonstrate an idea, a visual idea, and then it would be quickly erased. And people did draw on parchment as well, and there were people who drew on paper, but paper did not become as readily available until the 15th century, and that really changes the game in terms of drawing. Drawing really takes off in the 15th century for a few reasons, but essentially the most important one is that paper is more readily available. Now, in some respects, this does look like a sort of stiff model of a peacock, but then there are some attentions to naturalistic elements, to the color of his feathers, for example. He seems to have a little bit of character in his face, but nothing quite like this peacock, who is clearly drawn from life, who has this kind of animated, wonderful liveliness about him. And you look at the strokes of pen and ink. This is Pisanello, who's an early 15th century, early 15th century Italian artist. And one of my favorites, really. There are a number of wonderful works by him in the Louvre, which is really the first Italian collection that I got to know working in France. And then you also see these wonderful monkeys all around him in this study sheet. So it's a piece of paper being used not for any kind of formal purpose to pass along a design from one artist to another, but really to study the world around Pisanello and really the exotic things that he probably saw at the court where he was working. And we have works like this in our collection, which give a good sense of how fascinated artists were by the natural world in the 15th century. And now this is an extension, obviously, not just of having the means to draw, but also the interest in the world around you. And that has to do with the changing mindset of the Renaissance, with the reintroduction of classical ideas, with the rise of scientific thinking, with the rise of the idea of the Renaissance man as being able to pursue many different fields and areas of expertise. This is a wonderful work from the MFA collection by Fra Bartolomeo, a landscape with farm buildings and a pollarded mulberry tree. That means that the tree has been trimmed at the top so that the branches will come out. You see this in parks still. It's a wonderfully expressive tree with farmyard buildings in the background. And that is pen and ink. And you'll see that in the exhibition, we pay a lot of attention to these different techniques. One of them would be pen and ink, working with ink and a pen, usually a quill pen, a pen from the feather of a bird, not a peacock. And we see a lot of drawings in this period, and it stretches through into the 16th century and beyond, of interest in the world around the artist, including in everyday crafts. This is the exploration of sericulture, or the manufacture of silk, by Arcimboldo. So this is the artist who makes those wonderful faces that are composed of vegetables and other funny things. We have an amazing book by Arcimboldo in the MFA collection. And this is an example of a page from the book showing you the process of drying out the cocoons, women finding the cocoons, removing them from the branches, and exposing them to the sun so that they could preserve the silk. So that gives you a sense of the interest of Renaissance artists in the world around them, and have drawing as an extension of that interest. And here is an engraving. You'll see an illustration of it at the very beginning of the exhibition, showing you how much emphasis was placed on drawing in the conception of the Renaissance studio. This is the studio of Baccio Bandinelli. There was an exhibition about Bandinelli and his circle at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum recently. Did any of you see that? Yeah, it was a great exhibition, very thoughtfully selected. This is an engraving of his workshop, and all of the artists who work for Bandinelli are dressed in their best Renaissance outfits, and they all look very elegant and thoughtful, pensive. They are all drawing. This gives you a sense of how important this becomes. Now, the conception of the artist changes in this period. So along with the rise of the intellectual pursuit for the artist, it becomes this conception of the artist as an artist with a capital A philosopher, a poet, somebody who's equivalent to these what had previously been more prestigious, less labor-intensive fields of intellect and scholarship. In the past, and honestly even through this period, artists were associated with craftsmen. But there was this desire on their part, and in some cases it was very successful, to remove themselves from the taint of handicraft and to achieve something higher. So if you recall that John Garton gave you that list of Leonardo's list of his attributes for Ludovico Sforza, his potential patron at the court of Milan, and he listed all of the ways that he could work for him as a military engineer. So he is emphasizing his intellectual capacity as an artist above and beyond his skills as a handicraft person. So here in the studio, the act of drawing in some ways becomes similar to the act of composing, creating in a very intellectual way. So like jotting down thoughts in a journal, for example, which is something that you see in the exhibition in the Codex. Jotting down thoughts, jotting down visual ideas, there becomes this continuity between those two things. Also notice along here the kinds of things that, this is Eneo Vico is the engraver doing this engraving, the kinds of things that he emphasizes, probably under Bandinelli's, well, probably after a design by Bandinelli, but under Bandinelli's aegis, that you have a classical figure, the type of figure who would have been discovered in the Renaissance in kind of archaeological digs of a sort, then also studying anatomy, human beings. You have volumes of books. Books are more readily available. Leonardo has inventories of books that he wants to buy when he goes to the stationer's store. He also had inventories of his clothing, which was very fancy. Purple and pink tunics. He was known as being very elegant and very charming, unlike Michelangelo. So we'll get to that in a minute. And I love this drawing. This is not in the MFA collection, but to give you a sense of how important it was to draw from life, but also to draw the discoveries of the classical age that were popping up around Italy. And you have this wonderful drawing. It's in the Getty Collection by Federico Zuccaro of his brother Taddeo in the Vatican Belvedere Court, drawing the Laocoon, which is one of the most important sculptures that was discovered in this period. And that's this guy. And here is Taddeo. You can read it along here, along the trim of his coat. And this is pen and ink with wash. And wash is when you take a diluted solution of ink and you brush it on with a brush, and it creates larger areas of tone. So again, another work from the MFA collection. You may again be wondering what this has to do with Leonardo, but when we're talking about materials, this is a particularly interesting one to consider. Roger van der Weyden's St. Luke drawing a portrait of the Virgin, and what is he drawing it on? Does anyone know? Someone knows. Yeah, somebody said silver point. Yeah. Okay, so to try to make things easier in the exhibition, we've called everything metal point, but silver point is a form of metal point. Here you go. So what he has is a piece of paper that's been prepared, and this is an ancient technique. People were doing it as far back as the ancient Greeks and Romans. You could prepare a tablet, or you could prepare a piece of paper or parchment with a kind of bone solution. Actually, in Cennino Cennini's handbook, he says, sounds pretty disgusting. When you need some bone for priming this little panel, this is bone that you've already scraped and ground. He recommends the thigh bone of a gelded lamb. Take less than half a bean of this bone, or even less, and stir this bone up with saliva. Spread it all over the little panel with your fingers, and before it gets dry, hold the little panel in your left hand and tap over the panel with the fingertip of your right hand until you see that it is quite dry. And then you can take a stylus with a metal tip, lead, copper, silver, and you can draw on the preparation. And as the metal moves over the surface, that ground, which is like a very fine sandpaper ground, I mean, you wouldn't feel that yourself, but the ground has enough of a tooth that it picks up little bits of metal from the stylus, and that creates your line. And it's very difficult to erase and start over. So for the most part, you want to get it right the first time. So there's a sense of exacting precision that goes along with metal point. Generally, artists were not using metal point to make quick sketches of peacocks and monkeys. They were using it to draw a very finished portrait of the Virgin and Child, or something equally elevated. And we have some beautiful examples of metal point drawings in our collection at the MFA. One of my favorites for looking at the whole process of drawing is from the school of Filippino Lippi. Some people have thought it was Filipino Lippi over time, and that is typical of old master drawings. So drawings from this period are often attributed and reattributed, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in a lecture. So you seated on a stool. So this is clearly somebody who's modeling for somebody else to draw. He's striking a pose, and somebody is drawing it. And this silver point on an ochre preparation, so the bone that was, or whatever solution was put on the paper, was tinted, so that it would create a middle tone. So then you would have your darker tone with the silver point, and then you would put on some light white tones usually with a brush, very fine brush. And then one of the finest drawings, metal point drawings in our collection, is by Lorenzo di Credi, who was a contemporary of Michelangelo, of Leonardo, and of Michelangelo, actually. This is a head of a youth, and it has this wonderful kind of eeriness that he's so incredibly engaging, as if he's really staring out at you, but he's just barely appearing from the paper. And part of that is that metal point is a very delicate technique, but also some metal point fades a little bit over time and becomes even more delicate. I don't know why this is shaking so much. Let me take a glass of water. So these are two of the highlights of the exhibition itself. On the right is the drawing that's the star of the exhibition. The couriers from Italy called her superstar. And on the left is another drawing which is equally beautiful in its own way and is probably not by Leonardo. And in the exhibition, I have said that it is by one of his followers, Boltraffio, but this is a question that it's a question for scholarly debate. So we'll talk about that also in a little bit. But for now, I wanted to highlight for you that they are both metal point drawings. So let's start looking then at the exhibition and the thematics of the exhibition, while also concentrating on Leonardo's techniques and materials. The first room of the exhibition, you see an exploration of Leonardo's idea of beauty in terms of the theory of contrasts. This theory was in the air in the late 15th century. It was something that Leonardo would have come across in Verrocchio's studio. But of course, Leonardo was always reading and exploring, so he could have encountered it in many other venues as well. And I'll go back to that drawing, but first I wanted to show you that, so you see it in the work of other artists of this period, for example, Domenico Ghirlandaio, in whose studio Michelangelo came of age. This is really one of my favorite paintings, so I had to stick it in somewhere. With this beautiful little boy and older man, and the combination of the two emphasizes each to a much greater degree than the idea is, anyway, than they would be on their own. So you come back here, and these figures, they don't have the same kind of connection that the two in Ghirlandaio had. Certainly not a father-son pair, I wouldn't think. But it's almost as if they're standing in opposition and, by contrast, increasing the intensity of each other. So on the left, you have the older man with his, what Kenneth Clark called his nutcracker chin. And on the right, you have this almost marmoreal youth who, for many people, believe that he was modeled on Salé, who was a member of Leonardo's household and who epitomized Leonardo's idea of beauty and who may have been Leonardo's special friend. He certainly stayed with him for a very long time, and in inventories of their clothing and other possessions, they seem to be mixed together. So the purple tunics and pink tights sometimes belong to Leonardo and sometimes belong to Salé. But he was also kind of a character and was known to have stolen from Leonardo and from the other students, and then eventually matured into a more responsible leader in the studio. And on the left, again, the older man, he's very similar to a number of older men that you see in Leonardo's drawings as he explores the possibilities of depicting old age, both in terms of what he sees with his eyes and then developing from that a kind of type. On the right is a figure that looks like he might actually be dead. It certainly begs the question with those blank eyes. And these, again, are red chalk drawings. Leonardo is one of the first artists to really use red chalk in a very and push the possibilities of it in this period. He wasn't the first person to use these materials like red chalk or black chalk, but he's one of the first to really explore its potential for expressive drawing. And on the left, drawing that probably relates to the Last Supper. It might be an apostle for the Last Supper, or there's some thought that he might be a Socrates on his deathbed, gesturing to his students. I encourage you in the exhibition to look very closely at these drawings and to try to find some of the characteristics that you would identify as being typical of Leonardo. One thing you might notice is this real interest in the funny ways that hair curls and how expressive it can be. And you see up here. He's fascinated by these curling ringlets. This is much more even typical of Leonardo. And in his writings and in his other drawings, you see parallels being drawn between the ringlets of hair, the ways that water moves in waves and forms eddies, the way that plants grow, that air flows over wings. He is fascinated by almost every manifestation of nature, and curious to find out what the controlling force is, or the thing that really binds all of those different manifestations together. And here's a wonderful portrait of an elderly man. This one I think has much more dignity to it than the first one, who is in contrast with the younger man. He's much less of a caricature, although there is some of that kind of veering toward the grotesque with the real emphasis on the sort of strange character of his chin. And Leonardo would go out in the streets of Milan and draw as many interesting looking people as he could find, looking for difference as much as consistency. Now, how does all of this interest in old and idiosyncratic and unusual, even peculiar, how does that fit in with any kind of concept of beauty? Well, this is one of my favorites in the exhibition. It doesn't reproduce very well, so that's why you need to go see it in person. Some people have thought that it's Cesare Borgia, who's the military leader, who was Leonardo's patron for a short period, and you can see him in the Borgia program, if any of you have seen that. But it is just a wonderful portrait of what looks like a very thoughtful man, captured very quickly, delicate red chalk on paper. First, so Leonardo works from left to right. So first he would have drawn this figure, and you can see this in the way that the strokes go also. Then coming over this line, this man is now turned in 3/4 profile, fascinated with the beard, of course, and the hair, and then in complete profile, and to some degree becomes more of a kind of sculptural figure. But we move from those studies of what you might think of as the real, or the more rough and earthy side of humanity, into more idealistic beauty. Divine and Worldly Beauty is the title of the second room in the exhibition. And what I'm showing you right now are two beautiful drawings, which actually are probably not by Leonardo himself, but by his very close followers, assistants, students. One of the things I point out in the wall labels is that it's almost impossible to have an exhibition of Leonardo drawings without including people from his school, who are sometimes known as the Leonardeschi. It doesn't really roll off your tongue. But this group followed Leonardo's principles. They copied his works. They finished his works for him in some cases, to such an extent that it's sometimes very difficult to tell whether a work is by Leonardo's hand or by one of his followers. And that kind of decision is the work of connoisseurs, people who have studied Leonardo for many, many years, very closely looking at real works of art. But it's something that you as visitors to the exhibition can also participate in and learn about. One of the things you'll notice in these two drawings, for example, is that the strokes of the metal point tend to go up like this. And that is a characteristic of a right-handed draftsman. It's very unusual to draw with your left hand or to write with your left hand in this period, not because people weren't left-handed, but because it was it was very much looked down upon. Children were urged to use their right hand, forced to use their right hand. And so Leonardo is very unusual in being so free with his left hand. Now this drawing, on the other hand, which is another beautiful drawing, which is not quite certain that it's by Leonardo, but it's probably by Leonardo and another draftsman. You see some of those left-handed strokes. And this one we can't really, even in the exhibition, it's very difficult to make this sort of thing out because this drawing is in very modeled condition. The top is what we call a modern paper insert. It's been fixed because it sort of deteriorated along these lines. It's amazing that this still exists, even a working drawing like this that an artist is using either in preparation for or for a canvas or after the canvas as a record of the work. This is a major commission from the workshop of Verrocchio, Leonardo's teacher. And Leonardo was allowed to contribute to it with this figure of an angel on the left. And when you see this work, it's really remarkable how you can actually see a different hand at work in the depiction of the angel. And you think about how much confidence Verrocchio must have had in his assistant to allow him to participate in this important commission. Well, here you have a better view of it. And here we have the star of the exhibition. And again, here we go with the left-handed strokes. And actually, when you use your left hand, generally, you wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, right-handed, going down like that. You would be going up like that. And if you look carefully, especially with pen and ink strokes, not as easy to see with metal point, you can see how the line sort of ends at the top, usually. One of the other things that you'll notice about this drawing, which is a study for the angel here in the Virgin of the Rocks, the version that's at the Louvre. There are two versions of this painting. One of them is at the Louvre, and the other one is in the National Gallery in London. And if you go to the Louvre, you will see this painting not too far, actually, away from the Ghirlandaio of the old man and the baby. It's in the same hallway. And of course, we've all learned in our art history textbooks 101 about the importance of this triangle in terms of the stability of this composition, and that it is the angel that invites us into the composition because we engage with her, and then we can look up. We look over to the Christ child, down to John the Baptist, and then she's surrounded by this natural, very natural feeling, but almost so natural it doesn't seem even real, setting, which for many people has to do with the idea of the Immaculate Conception, which is part of the point of making this painting for the confraternity of the Immaculate Conception. Anyway, back to the point of the drawing. For me, one of the most arresting things about the drawing is that it is so much more engaging even than the painted version of the angel. It really feels like you're looking at a real person and not just a superstar, but somebody who is complicated and thoughtful maybe even a little bit quizzical. And that separates her from all the other angels, in my mind, who are in the exhibition. All these other images of ideal beauty don't have the same kind of inner life as this figure, who was thought by Bernard Berenson, who was the advisor to Isabella Stewart Gardner, and who helped create some of the great collections in the U.S. at the beginning of the 20th century, to be one of the most beautiful drawings in the world. And Bernard Berenson was a mentor of Sir Kenneth Clark, who would go on to be the head of the National Gallery in London, I think at the age of 35. And also, we probably all know Sir Kenneth Clark from the series Civilization, which is one of the ways that I first learned about art history. Anyone else in the audience? Yeah. I remember watching Civilization while doing Stairmaster when I was in high school. That may date me somewhat. Sir Kenneth Clark said, "It is the most beautiful drawing, I dare say," because he was English, he had to add that, "I dare say, in the world." And it's interesting to see what the reactions of people are as they go into the room. Some people do think that she's the most beautiful. Others are disturbed that they find the Boltraffio to be more beautiful. So you'll have to tell me at some point what your reactions are. Oh, here's a better shot of the angel. And you can see how she doesn't quite grab us the way that the study does. In fact, when I look at this painting, some of the things that grab me even more than the human figures are these plants down here, which is part of Leonardo's voracious appetite for everything. These plants in and of themselves could be the most remarkable botanical studies in the world, and they certainly remind me of Albrecht Dürer's watercolors, of his studies of rabbits and other kinds of flora and fauna. So a sub-theme of the exhibition is the Renaissance men, contrasting Michelangelo with Leonardo, Michelangelo on the left, in terms of their varied approaches to this idea of beauty. In Raphael's School of Athens, he has Leonardo in the center in the guise of Plato, and then he has Michelangelo down here, who's incredibly muscular and incredibly brooding. And that gives you a sense of the difference in terms of their appearance to their friends, not just physical appearance, but Leonardo is seen as a central intellectual leader, and Michelangelo is certainly off on his own and not looking at anyone else. And that does have something to do, it has a lot to do with the way that their art looked as well. Although that I would say that if you were really going to go by how Leonardo's art looks in the end, I would have him pointing out to the world around him instead of pointing up to some kind of idea, because he continually said that one should not trust in the authority of established philosophies or theories. One should trust one's eyes. Here's a better shot of the two of them. Their rivalry comes to a head. Remember, Michelangelo is about 25 years younger than Leonardo. He also comes of age in Florence, which is his hometown. It wasn't Leonardo's hometown. And Michelangelo comes from a family who had high ideas about themselves. They were somewhat impoverished. They had at least had fallen lower on the social scale than they had been originally, but they had an established sense of themselves as a fine Florentine family. And Michelangelo enters the Medici court some years after Leonardo had been there. So he's sort of in the shadow of this other man. And then eventually their rivalry comes to a head in a commission. Both of them were commissioned to do battle scenes for an important salon or room in the Palazzo Vecchio, which is the building that John showed you last week, which is the center of government in Florence. And their battle scenes, if they are still there, and this is a question that people are pursuing actually, are covered over by the work of other artists now. But this gives you a little bit of a sense of what they might have looked like. This is the Battle of Anghiari by Rubens after Leonardo. And this is a copy of the Battle of Cassina by Michelangelo, but it's by another artist after Michelangelo. So we do have a few drawings related to this project, but we don't have the overall composition, and we certainly don't have the original frescoes, unless some people are arguing that perhaps we should try to recover them, and that is a very controversial topic. So we start out the Michelangelo section with drawings that look a little bit Leonardesque. We have on the right, it's quite difficult to see, even in the exhibition, you have to look very closely and carefully. A very elderly looking woman, and it is a naturalistic study, much more naturalistic and even unidealized than most things in Michelangelo's oeuvre or his body of work. And then on the left, you have a working sheet from his studio. Probably none of these drawings are actually by Michelangelo, but we know that it's from his workshop. And these are very finely drawn figures, an old elderly man who looks a lot like the Leonardo elderly men. And then a direct comparison being made with this kind of beast, which is a very Leonardo thing to do. This whole idea of comparing strands of hair to waves of water to air currents goes also through human beings to animals to grotesques, and you could keep working that out. I think this is the best comparison that we have in the exhibition. It's in the third room, which is called Science and Anatomy, and it is drawing on the left by Leonardo of men's legs, and a drawing on the right by Michelangelo. So Michelangelo has a kind of proportion diagram here, and something that also looks diagrammatic here. But it doesn't seem to have really determined anything. It's as if he's put a graph down and then just went for it and found something very elegant and pleasing, and here a little dramatic or stressed. These are probably related to the dying slaves from the unfinished tomb of Pope Julius II. And those sculptures of the dying slaves are in the Louvre also. And then here, Leonardo, on the other hand, has these very appealing but also very anatomically accurate studies of musculature and bones and how are the legs working together and what is it like when you put more weight on your left foot and the other one is still in the air, and is that how the body really works in motion? So you see the different ways that their minds are working, and this comes out in criticisms of each other. Michelangelo is criticized by Leonardo as being obsessed with muscles, filling his figures with bags of nuts, and then, of course, Michelangelo makes fun of Leonardo for never actually finishing anything. Because, and I will remind you, we have those two paintings that we know by Leonardo, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, and there's some 18 others that are here or there. One in the United States, the National Gallery in D.C., but that's not many paintings by somebody who's considered to be one of the greatest artists of all time. All the rest are drawings and codices, so books that are, one of which is in the exhibition. So in the end, you might say that Michelangelo won in terms of the number of works that you actually can see by his hand in great public spaces, and he pursued those projects relentlessly. Leonardo, on the other hand, pursued his scientific projects relentlessly, and I think in his mind, really, there was no division there between his artistic projects and his scientific projects, and you really do see that in the Codex. But just a little bit more on Michelangelo to give you a sense of how Michelangelo is looking more at classical sculpture and thinking about sculptures that he's going to make, than he is just studying what he sees with his eyes every day. Now that is something of a generalization. It's a nice way to polarize the two, but we see that even in a poll that I've pointed out here, Michelangelo is still interested in systems of proportion. He may not attend to them all the time, but he's interested in them. He attends dissections. He may not do 30 of them at night like Leonardo, but he's thinking about some of the same things that Leonardo is thinking about, just in a different way. And so in the exhibition, you can see these two poles, but you can also see some of the nuances between them. So this is a drawing in the exhibition. It's one of the most powerful ones by Michelangelo, and it's probably related to his sculpture of Dusk in this Medici chapel in Florence. And then we almost immediately go from Michelangelo's studies of sculptural figures to some sculptural figures by Leonardo. And Leonardo thought of himself as a sculptor. One of his most important commissions, never completely finished, was going to be a bronze equestrian statue for Ludovico Sforza in honor of Sforza's father. But even when he was working in the workshop of Verrocchio, and this is a sculpture by Verrocchio on the right, they were doing sculptural studies like this, where Leonardo is said to have created mannequins and draped them in cloth that would then dry, and the other students in Verrocchio's workshop could paint pictures of them as he's done here. So this is actually on linen, not on paper, and it's painted in opaque watercolor and wash. And it probably relates to sculptural projects along these lines, and you see how important draperies are in the creation of sculptures in that period. And drapery studies are something which artists continue to do even to this day, and which are really wonderful because you can just approach them without any knowledge at all. You don't need to know that it's an angel or that it's some kind of myth from a story you've never heard before. It's just cloth. It's a study of light and dark. It's a study of plastic values. They're beautiful. So this is the science and anatomy section is the last section. It's the section that includes the Codex. And what I said in the introductory wall label is that all strands of the exhibition lead to the drawing that we think of as the most beautiful drawing in the world. So you might wonder, how does a science and anatomy section lead to her? Well, we'll go through it, and then perhaps one of you can propose that to me. In addition to the studies of legs, we have studies of horses' legs. This in red chalk. Some of the darker lines are probably reinforced by Francesco Melzi, who is one of Leonardo's closest students and assistants. He actually traveled with Leonardo to France at the end of his life and inherited most of his belongings, including the Codex on the Flight of Birds. And I think if you look at this drawing and you know something about 20th century drawings, you can see how even modern artists are looking back at these amazing Renaissance study sheets for ideas about composition, that really, how do you fill up a sheet in such an extraordinarily energetic way? And why would you? Just for the pleasure of doing it, for the arrangement of figures in relation to each other? Because this isn't necessarily something that Leonardo would ever sell. Maybe he would show it to a patron in preparation for the bronze monument. But otherwise, it's pretty much a private work. And a lot of these study sheets are, and yet they're enchanting in terms of their disposition of figures on the space of the page. Here's another one which is a little bit more subtle. It is actually a metal point drawing of horses. So you think about how precise you have to be with metal point, how quick you have to be when you're studying a horse. And finally, we have the Codex on the Flight of Birds. This is a subject that interested Leonardo, he claimed, from his birth. Are any of you in the audience psychiatrists or psychoanalysts? Have any of you read Freud's study of Leonardo? Well, it's pretty weird. It's been a while for me, too. But it starts out talking about an early memory that Leonardo has of a vulture coming down to him in the crib and opening his mouth and beating his wings into his mouth. This sounds pretty preposterous to me, but it does show you how important birds and the idea of birds and flight were to Leonardo, and that it's one of his personal passions and something he pursues throughout his life, the idea that he can understand how birds fly, and he can translate that understanding into a machine to allow human beings to fly. And he got so close that his studies actually became inspiration for people like the Wright brothers, who did create flying machines and airplanes. Now, one of the things that is especially interesting about the folio spread that we have displayed in the exhibition is that there is this hidden red chalk drawing of a man underneath this writing. So this writing is Leonardo's typical mirror script. And some people wonder if maybe he was writing this way to encode his writing so that people wouldn't be able to read them. A little bit of Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code. There you go, Da Vinci Code. But it is equally as likely that he was just writing this way because it was more natural for him with his left hand, being so fluid in his left hand, to write starting from the right side of the page, working left. That way he wouldn't smudge the ink. That way he could write really quickly and he could draw at the same time. But back to the little red drawing here. Recently, in 2009, a team of journalists and imaging technicians, whatever that is, people who are very skilled at using things like PowerPoint to take out lines of text, isolated the drawing from the text, and then talked to doctors and other experts in facial features, and came up with the idea that this might be a self-portrait of the artist hidden under his text in the Codex. And for proof of that, they used a comparison with a drawing that has long been thought to represent Leonardo in old age. Now, the only problem is that this drawing actually stylistically dates to a period when Leonardo would have been about 40 years old. So it may be a projection of what he imagined he would look like in old age, or it may be some kind of a type, a kind of magus figure, as John Garton mentioned last week. Or it may be a study of someone else altogether. But it does look like, from the Raphael picture that we have, from another portrait that we have by Francesco Melzi, and you can see how incredibly skilled Leonardo's students are. This is a portrait by Melzi of Leonardo. It does bear similarities to this figure, which in turn do look something like this guy. So, is it a self-portrait or not? I still think it's inconclusive. One of the questions that I have is why he would eventually write over it, and why it becomes seemingly insignificant in the grander scheme of the Codex. But it is tantalizing to think that for such a personally significant volume that he would include a portrait of himself within it. Although you might argue that the volume itself, all of the writings and observations, are something of a self-portrait as well. And for me, those are the things that are the most arresting. And I'll read you a few quotes from the Codex from these pages. And this is the quote that we have in the exhibition. If the bird rose backwards with its wings when descending, it will move swiftly. And this happens because the wings beat the air, which then flows behind the bird to fill the vacuum it has left behind it. So very scientific. I mean, he has a really great understanding at least close to, I'm not an engineer, but it seems as if he's really studying the mechanics of how air and musculature and bones and feathers work together to produce this amazing thing. And then I wanted to highlight one of my favorite drawings in the exhibition, which is actually two little drawings, which also have to do with flight. They are of two insects, a dragon and a beetle, drawn probably at two separate times in his career because the styles are quite different. You see how this has a much more schematic feel to it with these horizontal strokes? And this one, you have this really, really delicate depiction of these like almost translucent wings of the dragonfly. Well, what I particularly like about these is that they really have a lot of personality. They look like a little bit menacing, certainly peculiar, very buggy. Something else I want you to notice, and everyone asked me about this, so why don't we just talk about it, are the collector's marks, these stamps. What are these? Why do you see them on so many sheets in the exhibition? As I said, these are collector's marks, and we can identify them. And now, of course, we even have a website where we can look them up and find out all about the person who had them. This one here, if you were to isolate it, would look like this. It's faded over time, so it's hard to make out. Now, if I wanted to find out what that was, I would go to a site called the Loot Collection, L-U-G-T, and I would look up according to a number of criteria. Palette, the letter R, I think you could even put in feather, and it would bring me to a number of possibilities, and then I would narrow them down to Sir Jonathan Richardson, an artist and collector in the 18th century. And maybe it was he who put the little clippings of bugs together on another sheet. Being such a refined connoisseur, he would realize that they weren't just humble pictures of little bugs, but something really exquisite. And then on the Loot Collection, you can find out all about him and his collection and whether he had any sales of his collection and where those works ended up. And this is important not just for interest's sake, but also because whenever you acquire anything in a museum of this nature, you do a provenance search and you try to find out what's happened to the object that allowed it to come to the point where it could be on the market. You certainly don't want to buy anything that might be the subject of some kind of a lawsuit, but there's also the question of trying to find out whether something has a prestigious past. And in this case, it does. And interestingly enough, this Lorenzo di Credi from our collection also has the same collector's mark. So it was also in the collection of Sir Jonathan Richardson. And the 18th century is when we see a lot of these drawings collections formed. It's also the period when people start to hang drawings on the walls and mount them in these beautiful blue mats that were the inspiration for the color of the walls in the exhibition. It's very much a Renaissance blue, but it's also a blue that has been shown over time to be very flattering to a lot of different drawing materials and techniques. And I was a little bit tired of the red burgundy that you see in every single old master drawings exhibition. I love it, and it immediately tells you that it's an old master drawings exhibition, but there are other colors that work well with the drawings, and blue is one of them. Now, interestingly enough, in the exhibition, there's also this drawing. I didn't show it to you before because I don't think it's very good, actually. Down here, somebody's written in hand, Di Credi. So someone at some point thought that it was by Lorenzo di Credi. And you see this a lot on old master drawings. You see someone, maybe a connoisseur, a curator, a collector, writing in the name of the artist that they believe that the work is by. Lorenzo di Credi was part of the same workshop as Leonardo. He's part of Verrocchio's workshop. He became head of it. And he influenced Leonardo, but then later he was influenced by Leonardo. So it's a possibility he could have drawn something Leonardesque like this. But I don't think that someone who drew something as incredibly sensitive as this drawing would necessarily have produced something which I find to be a little bit more clumsy, less confident. You see how harsh this line is around the figure, less skilled with the use of metal point, truly. Now, I'm not saying anything insulting about this work, because even the couriers from the Uffizi didn't think that much of it. So then you might wonder, why is it in the exhibition? Because it's interesting to show a range and variety of different works and styles and abilities, because that's the way that you truly can see how something is so much more skilled than another thing. This is another wonderful drawing that's in the exhibition that is not given to Leonardo, but rather to one of his circle. And I wanted to show you the part of the way that people decide these attributions is by comparison. So, of course, we have the strokes. I wanted to show you, this is more the way that the left-handed strokes go. This is the way the right-handed strokes go. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to make out the strokes in this slide, so this is perhaps not the best demonstration of that. Okay, she's a little bit better. But I wanted to show you this comparison, because this is a wonderful drawing which is in the Clark Collection in Williamstown, Mass., which has a wonderful collection of prints and drawings. Also, this is a drawing that was once thought to be by Leonardo da Vinci. Somebody wrote that here. Here's a collector's mark. I don't know whose collector's mark that is, but one could look it up by putting P and L into the Loot Collection site. And over time, people have identified this kind of sculptural face, this way of drawing, strokes like this, as being more typical of Boltraffio, Leonardo's most refined pupil, who has a style that actually, in terms of his painting style, is closer to the second version of the Virgin of the Rocks. So if you have a chance to compare those two, it's not really the subject of our talk today. And you see how, in some ways, she's very similar to this one in terms of the way that her face is made up, this kind of sculptural quality to her face. One of the reasons that this one is more successful, I think, is because you don't have this kind of blank expression that you have in the Clark version. So when the artist has the eyes looking down, he no longer has to deal with that potential weakness in his own technique. And you see how, okay, so I did include it, I couldn't remember. This is the second version of the Virgin of the Rocks, where everything becomes just a little bit more perfect, a little bit more idealized, to such an extent that for a long time people thought that this version might not have been by Leonardo, that it might have been by Boltraffio or one of his other students. And now scholars are coming around and starting to think, well, actually, Leonardo's conception of the Virgin of the Rocks, of human beings, changes over the course of his life. Why not his style too? And they've looked at those things, and so they think now that this work is most likely to be by Leonardo himself, even though it doesn't have the same kind of amazing naturalistic detail that you have in the first version. So then why wouldn't this be by Leonardo? And some people, including the curator who put together the exhibition from the Muscarelli Museum of Art in Virginia, do think that it's by him, and he thinks that maybe he's just working in a different way in this drawing in terms of the way that he uses the metal point and the kind of right-handedness that we see here and some of the other details that for him it's convincingly similar to this and not just a copy or an inspiration from the master. So I'll leave you on that, and you're welcome to ask me questions. We have about, I think, 15 minutes before we need to leave.
So there are wireless mics on either side of the auditorium. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. That's it? We covered all the bases? All right. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, happy
Thank
birthday,
you.
Leonardo. Okay.